The next thing I'm going to do is talk about the historical story behind Hanukkah. And this historical story behind Hanukkah centers around the character of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who was the ruler of Syria. After Alexander the Great died, his empire was split up, and Egypt was taken over by a general called Ptolemy, and founded a dynasty of the Ptolemies. In the Syrian part of the empire, we have the Seleucids, from the general Seleucid, take over, and Antiochus the Fourth was the son of Antiochus the Great, and he reigned from 175 BC, and he died in the year 164 BC. And he was a born-again pagan, and he focused his religious enthusiasm on the worship of Zeus. In Athens, he paid for a massive temple of the Olympian Zeus, and some of that temple still remains. It's on the sort of fields just down below the Acropolis. There are a few columns of this temple still standing. It was a massive undertaking and cost an enormous amount of money. So the Roman sources refer to Antiochus as beloved of the gods, but the traditional Orthodox Jews living at the time had a slightly different view of him, although not all the Jews were opposed to him. He was eccentric, he was very liberal with his money, and he didn't have much respect for other people, basically. His attitude towards the Jews was that, he got a bit annoyed with us, to put it bluntly. We were part of his kingdom, and at that time we fell underneath the area that he was in control over. It was either him in control of Israel or the Egyptians under Ptolemy, one or the other, and he had control over, essential political control over what was at that point Palestine. He wanted to denationalize his subjects. He wanted to create an empire that was based around Hellenic culture. One empire. He didn't want to have sort of like a European Union with lots of different countries in it. He wanted to have one unified country. And he wasn't that convinced that those subjects of his who spoke Aramaic, and we were the Jews speaking Aramaic and Hebrew, were sufficiently Greek. Just because we had started having Greek names, and some of the gods that were worshipped by our ancestors had been dropped in favor of Greek gods, he wanted to create one Greek kingdom. He believed that Greek culture was superior. Anyway, the Jews were not, all of the Jews anyway, were not opposed to this. And certainly the more liberal-minded Jews had no problem with Antiochus and supported him, and were quite Greek. They wanted to have a gymnasium in Jerusalem. They wanted Greek sports, Greek culture, Greek theatre, and all these things took place under Antiochus. Antiochus started to meddle, however, in religious issues, particularly over who would be the high priest in the temple in Jerusalem. And this is where things became a bit unstuck, as I will discuss after this brief interruption.
This podcast is part of the MyPodcast.com network. Go online right now and get your very own 100% free podcast, MyPodcast.com.
There was a rebel family of high priests, the Tobiads, and they ended up going off and building their own temple, actually, somewhere else. And there was a political struggle. Conservatives and a legitimate high priest, they approached the Ptolemies, the kings of Egypt, for political support, and the Tobiads, however, were not legitimate priests, and they understood that Antiochus was available if he was paid. And so the Tobiad group caused the deposition of the standing high priest in 173 and bribed Antiochus to appoint their party to the high priesthood, someone called Jason. And this new high priest established an arena for public games very close to the temple, a gymnasium, and introduced Greek culture into Jerusalem. But the king was not persuaded by this, and somebody else, another guy called Menelaus, bribed the king himself again. He saw that the king had been bribed to put Jason into position, and he offered the king even more money if he was made high priest. And this is what happened. Menelaus was made high priest in the year 171, and Jason was kicked out. Menelaus was not fit to be the high priest according to the Jewish religion, and so the conservatives, the Orthodox Jews, were opposed to his being a high priest, and Menelaus was also not particularly interested in Judaism as a religion, but rather as a means of acquiring wealth and political power. At this time, Antiochus had engaged in a military campaign against Egypt. Remember, the Egyptians were ruled by the Ptolemies. Remember, Cleopatra was a descendant of a Ptolemy. She was a Ptolemy. And Antiochus started the military campaign against Egypt. At this time, Rome was just starting to become very powerful. And the Ptolemies got Roman support. So what happened was that Antiochus arrived on the border of Egypt, and instead of finding himself waging a battle against the Egyptian army, he came up against a Roman legate. And the Roman legate came up to Antiochus' army, called Antiochus out from his troops, and he took his fasces, his symbol of power. There was his bundle of sticks that he carried as his authority of a Senate of Rome, and he drew a line in the sand, the famous line in the sand that you may have heard of. And he told Antiochus that he could not pass this line, and if he did, he would be at war with Rome. Now Antiochus knew that he couldn't fight a war against Rome and win, so he turned round and went back. However, while he was away, and this was going on in Egypt, a rumor had started in Jerusalem that he had been killed. And so Menelaus, who had become the high priest because he had bribed his way into the job, had to leave, because once the rumor came that Antiochus was dead, his political support evaporated and he had to run away. And Antiochus came to Jerusalem in order to reinstate Menelaus as high priest, and at this time, and of course Antiochus is very annoyed. He's very annoyed because he couldn't invade Egypt. He's just been humiliated in public by the Romans, in front of his entire army and in front of the entire world. And he gets back, he passes through Jerusalem on the way, and he finds out that his high priest, who he has appointed, has been kicked out by these rabble, these Orthodox rabble. And so what Antiochus does is that he declares effective war against Judaism, and he says, okay, you Jews, you Orthodox people, you don't like what I'm trying to do, you don't like my theatres, you don't like my gymnasiums, you don't like my Olympic Games. Well, he says, basically, I'm finished with you. And he entered the temple, he took away all the gold, he took away all the silver, he took away the golden candlesticks, he took away the altar, the showbread table, everything. And he then outlawed Judaism. And he said that Judaism, he said, should no longer be practiced, and the official worship of the Jewish religion is now, from henceforth, banned. And he tried to do that. Now, well and good. He sent an officer of his, Apollonius, to go through the land of Israel at that time, which of course was under his political control. It wasn't an independent country, it was Antiochus's, it was part of his kingdom. And and Apollonius went in to Jerusalem, and he basically started massacring the inhabitants, men, women, and children. And he fortified the city of David and built a huge castle overlooking the temple, and he made Jerusalem into a Greek colony, into a Hellenistic colony. This action, by the way, was not completely unsupported by all of the Jews. Many of the Jews were against the ultra-Orthodox faction and were in favor of Hellenic culture and regarded it as a higher form of culture than Jewish culture and civilization, and were in favor of what was going on. A royal decree in the year 168 banned the public celebration of the Sabbath, banned the festivals, banned circumcision, ordered that all of the holy books of Judaism should be handed in to be destroyed, and Jews were compelled to offer sacrifices to the idols, especially those to Zeus, which had been erected throughout Palestine. The commanders of Antiochus were then given regulations to carry out these instructions, and they did this, and an inquisition was held against the Jews, and there were monthly courts of law. Those Jews who were found to be worshipping Judaism were brought before the courts, tried, etc. And the possession of a Torah scroll, the performance of a public rite of circumcision, was a death offense. And what happened was that the altar in the temple was dedicated to Zeus, and burnt offerings were offered to Zeus, and the Jews were obliged to worship Zeus. Now, many of the Jews regarded Zeus as the chief god of the Greeks, as he was the god of gods, and they saw him as being equivalent to our God, who was also the chief god, and they had no real problem with this. But the ultra-Orthodox Jews, especially those Jews living in the countryside, not the Jews who were more urban and more Hellenized, but the Jews living in the countryside, were unable to tolerate or stomach this at all. And a revolution started. Initially it was a passive revolution, and many Jews simply suffered martyrdom. Hundreds and hundreds of Jews refused to accept the imposed Hellenism of Antiochus, and a resistance movement was started. Now, what happened was that things were getting a bit iffy in Palestine, but Antiochus wanted to go to war, and he decided to go to war against the Persians. So he decided basically to invade Iraq. Now, you all know what invading Iraq entails. It hasn't changed much in 2,000 years. Antiochus went off to invade Iraq, and with him went almost his entire army. He left a commander in charge running the kingdom of Syria, which included Palestine. This guy was called Lysias. And Lysias was instructed to send soldiers against the Jews and to destroy them completely should there be an uprising. However, of course, Antiochus had gone to fight against Persia, and he had taken almost the entire army with him. So Lysias didn't have many soldiers left, and those soldiers he did have were not the best soldiers that Antiochus had. Anyway, while Antiochus was away, while the cat's away, the mice will play, and there were indeed revolutions within Palestine. Everything was, and the Orthodox Jews rose up, and Lysias sent Ptolemaeus, a general, and then he sent Nicanor, and then he sent Gorgias, each of these with armies, and each of these armies were defeated by the Jewish rebels, one after the other, in the year 166 to 165. And Lysias himself had to flee to the capital of Syria called Antioch, and the Jews were victorious. However, nothing was done in the lifetime of Antiochus. This is where the story basically stops, because what happens is that Antiochus dies in Persia, in the city of Tabai, in the year 164. And that is the end of the Hanukkah story. The Jews, of course, when they did conquer under Lysias' army, they did re-enter the temple, and they did rededicate it, but of course Antiochus was not there. Antiochus had died. what happened next, of course, is that the next king of Syria re-invades, and takes a while before there's complete independence. So the reason why the Jews succeeded in the story of Hanukkah is that, firstly, Antiochus wasn't around to defeat them. He had gone off to fight against Iraq and or what was then Persia. And the civil war of the Orthodox Jews against the Hellenized Jews. The Hellenized Jews didn't have a chance. They couldn't protect themselves because Antiochus wasn't able to provide a sufficiently trained army, and the Orthodox Jews defeated those Jews who supported Antiochus, and so we have the Hanukkah story as we know it. As you can see in this, there's nothing about a miracle of the oil or anything like that. The Hasmoneans, we know, entered the temple. We know they had a great festival, and it was 8 days long. The Code of Jewish Law, the Aruch HaShulchan, says that yes, there was a miracle of the oil, but this is a miracle that was totally unnecessary. This is what the Rabbi Epstein says. He's an Orthodox rabbi. He says the real reason why it's 8 days long is that it takes 8 days to dedicate the temple, as we know from Moses himself that the tabernacle took 8 days, and Nehemiah that his rebuilding took 8 days, and if you go back to Solomon, that Solomon's temple also took 8 days to dedicate the altar, and that's why we have an 8-day festival. And that is the end of that story.